The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was eating cereal at my kitchen counter and trying to talk myself into going to the gym. Thomas Keene's name on my screen meant one thing. He was my Aunt Ruth's estate attorney, and he only called when something had shifted. I picked up on the second ring. He got straight to it, the way Thomas always did. "Your aunt passed 2 weeks ago," he said. "You already knew that. What you didn't know was what she left behind." He told me the number twice before I stopped chewing. $62 million and the lakehouse in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Everything, airtight, in a trust with my name on it and mine alone. I set the spoon down. Aunt Ruth had never acted like someone with $62 million. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru and fixed her own gutters. She grew tomatoes in the backyard of that lake house and mailed me a jar of homemade jam every fall without fail. Even when I was living out of a suitcase in Boston finishing my grad program, she was the person in my family who showed up. Not just at the big moments, but the ordinary ones. She'd flown out to Nashville 3 years ago just because I'd had a rough week, and she could tell from the sound of my voice over the phone. So when Thomas said 62 million, my first emotion wasn't excitement. It was grief all over again, sharp and fresh, and then underneath it, something colder. Because my first real thought, the one that cut right through the grief, was that if my brother Derek found out before I had a chance to get everything locked down, this was going to get very ugly, very fast. Derek and I had never been close, not really. We were 4 years apart and felt further than that. He was the kind of person who kept a running tally of everything in his head, who got what, who had more, who came out ahead. When we were kids, it showed up as competition. Good grades, sports, whose friends were cooler. By the time we were adults, it had turned into something less harmless. He'd married Sandra 6 years ago, and Sandra had a gift for turning Derek's low-grade resentments into full strategies. Sandra was the type who researched the price of every gift before she said thank you. She'd once pulled me aside at a family dinner to ask, casually, like it was small talk, whether Aunt Ruth had ever mentioned updating her will. I'd brushed it off at the time. I wasn't brushing it off now. I told Thomas to keep things quiet until I could get to Knoxville and meet with him in person. He agreed without hesitation. He'd known Aunt Ruth for 30 years. He understood the landscape. I was packed in my car by noon. The drive from Nashville to Gatlinburg was about 3.5 hours, winding east through rolling hills that eventually rose into mountains. I had my phone on the car's Bluetooth, going over the mental checklist the same way I did before any big contract review at work. Verify the documents, secure the accounts, change the access passwords on everything connected to the trust before anyone outside the room knew the number. I never made it to Thomas's office that afternoon. I was 40 minutes outside of Knoxville, merging onto a 2-lane stretch of state highway, when a pickup truck hit me from behind. Not a tap, not a fender bender. A full rear-end collision at highway speed that sent my car spinning into the guardrail. I remember the sound first, this metallic crunch that felt like it was inside my skull, then the airbag, then the silence. The paramedics arrived fast. The first responder who reached my window was calm and clear-voiced, and I remember being grateful for that while the world kept tilting. They got me out carefully, strapped me to a board, and loaded me into an ambulance. I gave them my name, my emergency contact, Thomas Keene's number, and asked someone to please retrieve my bag from the car. Old habits. You secure your information before you secure anything else. At the hospital, they found 2 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a moderate concussion. The ER doctor, a tired-looking man named Dr. Osei, explained that I'd be there at least 2 days, possibly 3, depending on how the concussion symptoms settled. He said it plainly and without any softening, which I appreciated. I wasn't the kind of person who needed things wrapped up gently. I needed the facts. I got myself set up in the hospital room and called Thomas from the bed. He'd already heard about the accident. He was grave but measured. "Take care of yourself first," he said. "The paperwork will wait." I told him what I'd told no one else in my life, almost ever. "It won't wait," I said. "I need you to prepare those trust documents for mobile signing. I don't want to give anyone time to get ahead of this." He understood. He said he'd have everything ready within 48 hours. I called Joanna next. She'd been my manager at the contract consulting firm I'd worked at before going independent, and over 4 years she'd become one of the few people I trusted without conditions. She answered on the first ring, heard the words hospital and accident, and said she'd drive up from Chattanooga that evening. She arrived at 7 with a proper meal from a restaurant down the street and the no-nonsense energy of someone who understood how to be useful without being loud about it. We ate and talked through logistics. She'd handle my emails for the next 48 hours and route anything that looked urgent directly to me. She'd tell no one where I was or why, not until I said otherwise. The first morning in the hospital was quiet in the way hospitals are quiet, constant low noise that somehow adds up to stillness. A nurse named Carolyn took my vitals around 6 and told me the doctor would be in after rounds. I was sitting up with my coffee when the door opened and my brother walked in. Derek looked the same as always. Tall, well-dressed in that carefully calculated way, the kind of person who made casual clothes look like a statement. He said, "I heard what happened," and his voice had the warmth it always had when he wanted something. I said, "Word travels fast." He sat down in the chair near the window. Mom told me. She heard from someone at Thomas's office. I filed that away. Someone at Thomas's office. I would be following up on that. He asked how I felt. I told him I'd had worse. He made small talk for a few minutes, and I let him, watching the shape of it the way you watch the edge of a storm to see which direction it's moving. Then he said, "Aunt Ruth really left you the whole thing, huh?" There it was. "Thomas will be in touch with the family once the formal process is complete," I said. "I'm not the family," he said, leaning forward a little. "I'm your brother." "Same answer," I said. His expression shifted, just slightly. Not quite hurt, not quite angry, calculating. He said something about how 62 million was a lot for one person to manage alone, that maybe having family involved in the process would take some of the pressure off. I recognized the phrasing immediately because I'd heard it before in different forms in conference rooms when someone was trying to get a stake in something they didn't own. I told him I was tired and needed to rest. He left, but Sandra came back an hour later. She didn't knock. She pushed open the door with a paper coffee cup in each hand like she was doing me a favor. She was wearing a blazer over a silk blouse, full makeup, hair done. She'd dressed for something, and it wasn't a hospital visit. She sat down, set one of the coffees on my tray table, and launched in so smoothly it would have impressed me in another context. She said she'd been thinking about Aunt Ruth's estate and how overwhelming it must be, inheriting something that size on top of a traumatic accident, and she happened to know a financial advisor who specialized in family trust management. And would I mind if he just stopped by to introduce himself? I looked at her for a moment. The coffee was still steaming, untouched. "Who told you the amount?" I asked. She blinked. "Derek mentioned." "Derek didn't know the amount," I said. "I didn't tell him." A pause. She recovered fast. Sandra always did. I may have heard it somewhere else. Thomas's assistant, maybe. I made another note. Thomas's assistant. I told her I already had legal representation and wasn't looking for anything additional. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach past the cheekbones and said she was only trying to help. When she stood to leave, she said, "You know this affects all of us. That house has been in the family for decades." "It was Aunt Ruth's house," I said. "Now it's mine." After she left, Joanna, who had been sitting quietly in the corner the whole time, set down her phone and looked at me. "She's already working something." "I know," I said. "I just don't know what yet." Thomas came to the hospital the next afternoon with a leather portfolio and the kind of quiet authority that comes from 30 years of handling high-stakes documents in difficult rooms. He walked me through every line of the trust. 62 million, liquid and invested, full control upon my signature. The lakehouse in Gatlinburg, deed in my name, no co-ownership, no contingencies. Aunt Ruth had been thorough in a way that told me she had thought about exactly this scenario when she set it up. I signed. Thomas closed the portfolio with the same measured motion he probably used for every document he'd ever closed, as if the weight of the moment was ordinary to him. He told me the transfer would process within 72 hours. He also told me, with a slight tightening around his eyes, that he'd need to address something about his office. Someone had accessed my file without authorization. I said I was already aware something had gotten out. He said he'd handle it internally, and had already suspended the assistant in question pending review. He apologized twice. I told him once was enough. After he left, I started making calls. Over the next 2 days in the hospital, I built a picture of what Sandra had already put in motion. A woman from my professional network in Nashville called to check in and mentioned that Sandra had reached out to her, presenting herself as helping to manage the transition of a family estate. She'd used my name. She'd implied we were operating together. A former client of mine texted asking if I was involved in something called Harmon Legacy Group. He'd been approached by someone representing it. He said it sounded legitimate, but the numbers didn't add up. I asked him to forward everything he'd received. I sat in that hospital bed reading through the emails on my phone and felt the anger settle into something cooler and more useful. Sandra wasn't improvising. She'd been ready for this. The timeline told me she'd known about the inheritance before I did, probably from whatever contact she had in Thomas's office, and she'd used the gap between when I found out and when I was incapacitated in a hospital bed to start building a parallel version of reality where she had access to what was mine. Joanna drove back to Chattanooga to pull together everything she could find on Harmon Legacy Group through public records. She had a background in contract law and knew her way around state filings. What she sent me that evening was enough to confirm what I'd suspected. The LLC had been filed 4 days after Aunt Ruth's passing. Listed address was Derek's house. Listed contact was Sandra, no other disclosed members. She was setting up a vehicle to siphon credibility from my name. Get it established, get people associating it with the Harmon estate, and then use that association to raise money, close deals, and do whatever she'd had planned before I'd even known there was anything to protect. I was discharged on the 3rd day with a sling on my right arm, a bottle of pain medication, and a list of follow-up appointments. Joanna picked me up and drove me to the lakehouse rather than back to Nashville. I needed to see it before anyone else got there. The house sat on a wide lot at the edge of the lake, surrounded by old oaks and a long wood dock that extended out over still water. It was exactly how I remembered it from summers as a kid, that same front porch with the 2 rocking chairs Aunt Ruth had repainted every spring without fail. I stood in the driveway for a long moment before I went inside. Everything was in order, nothing had been disturbed. I walked through every room slowly, checking locks, checking windows, noting what needed to be updated. In the back office, Aunt Ruth's filing cabinet was still organized the way she kept everything, labeled, dated, methodical. I found her personal copy of the trust documents right where I expected them to be. I sat down at her desk and let myself be still for a minute. She had known what she was doing when she left all of this to me. She hadn't done it carelessly or out of sentimentality. She'd done it because she'd watched the family long enough to know where things would land if she didn't draw the lines herself. Sitting in her chair, in her house, I understood that. I wasn't going to let Sandra or Derek turn this into a circus she'd spent decades protecting. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed. Then I called a security company and arranged for cameras and a motion-activated system to be installed by the end of the week. Then I called Thomas and told him what I'd found about Harmon Legacy Group. He pulled up the filings while we were still on the phone. He said the unauthorized use of my name in a business entity without my knowledge or consent was actionable. He'd draft a letter to the State Commerce Office and prepare a cease and desist to Sandra directly. If the LLC had been used to solicit money from anyone, that created additional exposure for her. He kept his voice professional, but there was something underneath it, the tone of a person who had worked for Aunt Ruth for 3 decades and was not going to let her wishes be undermined. Joanna arrived at the lake house mid-morning with her laptop and 2 boxes of files she'd printed out. We set up at the kitchen table and went through everything together. Sandra had reached out to at least 8 people in my network. 3 of them had responded positively. 1 had already agreed to a meeting. I spent the afternoon calling each one. I was direct without being dramatic. I explained the situation, made clear that Harmon Legacy Group had no connection to me, and told them to document anything Sandra had sent them. Most people were understanding, a little embarrassed that they'd almost been taken in, quick to offer support. The one who'd already agreed to meet with her was less comfortable, but he promised to cancel. By evening, the picture was contained on that front. 8 people, 8 closed doors. The test came 4 days after I'd moved into the lake house. I was on the back porch early in the morning, coffee in hand, watching fog lift off the water the way it does on cold lake mornings, slow and unhurried, like the day hasn't decided to start yet. My phone buzzed. It was the new security system sending an alert. A car had pulled up the gravel drive. I went inside and pulled up the camera feed on my phone. Derek's car. And behind it, an SUV I didn't recognize. I met them at the front door before they could knock. Derek was wearing a smile that meant he'd prepared for this. Sandra was standing just behind his left shoulder in a coat I recognized as her important meeting coat. Beside her was a man in slacks and a canvas jacket, the kind of studied casual that people wear when they're trying to seem approachable while talking about money. "We thought we'd stop by," Derek said, like it was spontaneous. "This is private property," I said. "You don't have a key, and you weren't invited." The man in the canvas jacket stepped forward and extended his hand. "Ryan Walsh. I work with your family on estate transitions." "You don't work with my family," I said. You work with Sandra. And this conversation is over. Ryan Walsh looked at Sandra. Sandra kept her expression composed in a way that cost her something. Derek's smile had gone flat. We drove 4 hours, he said. That was your choice, I said. I didn't ask you to. Sandra spoke then, her voice careful and even. Mara, we're not here to fight. We're here because this property has emotional significance for all of us, and there are decisions to be made about how it's used going forward. Those decisions are mine, I said. Aunt Ruth made sure of that. You both know what the trust says. The trust is a legal document, Sandra said. It doesn't account for everything. It accounts for exactly what it needs to, I said. Ryan, I'd recommend not pursuing this line of business with anyone connected to this estate. For your own protection. He looked at me for a moment, recalibrating. I could see him deciding whether Sandra was worth the complication. Based on his expression, the answer was leaning toward no. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I stood in the hallway listening to the sound of gravel under tires as they left. Then I called Thomas. He had the no trespass documentation filed with the county sheriff's office by that afternoon. Certified letters were sent to both Derek and Sandra. If either of them set foot on the property without my explicit written permission, it was trespassing, full stop. Thomas included a separate note in Sandra's letter specifically addressing the LLC. She had 5 business days to dissolve Harmon Legacy Group or face legal action for fraudulent business practices and unauthorized use of personal identity in a commercial entity. I found out 3 days later that Ryan Walsh had quietly removed himself from any association with Sandra's venture. Apparently, once I'd named the LLC in conversation with 2 people in the regional investment community, the air had gone out of it fast. Sandra had built her credibility on the assumption that no one would check. The moment someone did, it collapsed. Joanna was at the lakehouse the afternoon the LLC dissolution notice came through. We were sitting on the back porch, and she handed me her phone with the screenshot. I read it twice, set the phone down on the arm of the chair, and looked out at the water. It wasn't triumphant exactly. It was quieter than that. The threat to my professional network was contained. The property was legally secured. The trust was signed, the accounts were locked, and Sandra no longer had a vehicle to run her scheme through. Derek had gone quiet after the certified letter arrived. My mother had called once, sounding stiff and uncertain, and I had been honest with her in a way I hadn't been before. I told her what Sandra had done. I told her about the LLC, about the impersonation, about the emails Sandra had sent to my contacts. My mother was silent for a long time. Then she said, I didn't know it had gone that far. I believed her. She wasn't complicit, she was just slow to see what had always been visible to everyone else. I told her I wasn't looking for an apology. I just wanted her to understand why I was drawing the lines I was drawing. She said she understood. We hung up without warmth, but without hostility either, which felt like its own kind of resolution. The week after everything settled, I sat down with Thomas one more time at the lakehouse. He brought coffee and a small paper bag of pastries from a place in town, and we went over the final checklist. Every legal protection in place, every account secured. The property management rights formally documented in my name only. The licensing complaint I'd filed against Harmon Legacy Group had been forwarded to the state attorney's office for review. Thomas thought it would go nowhere in terms of criminal charges, but it would create a permanent record that would follow Sandra's name in any future business filings. He flipped the portfolio closed the same way he had in the hospital room, with that same measured finality. He said, Your aunt would be pleased. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the dock and the water beyond it. She'd sent me jam every fall. She'd flown to Nashville just because I'd sounded tired on the phone. She'd spent years quietly making sure that when she was gone, what she'd built would land with someone who'd protect it. I understood now that the $62 million and the lake house weren't just an inheritance. They were a statement. She'd known exactly what the family would do. She'd known who Derek was, who Sandra was, and she'd structured every line of that trust to make sure none of it could be touched without my hand on it first. I hadn't protected the inheritance. I'd honored what she'd already built. Joanna left the following Sunday. She'd stayed longer than she'd planned, and I didn't ask her to stay longer still. Before she drove out, she stood by her car and said, You handled that the right way. I said I wasn't sure there was a right way, just a disciplined one. She laughed, and then she was gone. I spent the rest of the day alone at the lake house. I walked the property, checked the new camera angles, made a few notes about repairs I wanted to schedule in the spring. In the late afternoon, I took a cup of tea out onto the dock and sat at the end of it with my legs over the edge, the water dark and still below me. I thought about what the last 3 weeks had cost. Not the legal fees, not the hours on the phone or the nights I'd spent cataloging Sandra's moves on a whiteboard in the bedroom upstairs. I thought about the cost of having to be that alert, that structured, that constantly ready for the next angle. The cost of knowing that the people who should have been relieved I was alive after that accident had instead seen an opportunity in my hospital room. I didn't let myself stay there long. There was no version of this where I could control what Derek and Sandra were. I could only control what I'd done in response. And what I'd done was hold the line without becoming someone I wasn't. I hadn't manipulated. I hadn't retaliated out of anger. I hadn't burned anything down out of spite. I'd documented. I'd acted. I'd been precise. The sun was dropping behind the ridge across the lake, turning the water bronze and then gray. Somewhere in the tree line, something moved, a bird or a deer, and went quiet again. I sat there until it was fully dark and the dock lights clicked on automatically. The house behind me was still and solid and entirely mine. Aunt Ruth had known, I think, that someday I'd sit exactly here, in exactly this quiet, and that it would mean I'd made it through whatever came at me from the direction of family. She hadn't warned me. She hadn't needed to. She'd just made sure the ground was steady under my feet so that when I got here, I could stand on it. I picked up my empty cup and walked back up the dock. The water lapped softly behind me. The lights were on in the house. The locks were changed, the cameras were running, and every document that mattered was in order. None of what had happened had changed who I was. That was the part no one who'd come after me had counted on.